The murmurs in the grand hall had barely settled when Isabella shifted slightly, gliding through the crowd with the kind of confidence that demanded attention without demanding it. Each step was deliberate, her heels clicking softly against the marble, a rhythm that seemed to underscore the subtle transformation of power in the room. Alejandro, who had until now dominated the space with his arrogance and charm, suddenly felt the weight of eyes on him, not with admiration, but with questioning, curiosity, and even admiration directed at her. Isabella's gaze swept across the guests, acknowledging subtle nods and whispered recognitions. She had prepared for this, quietly building alliances, nurturing her own reputation, and cultivating an aura of success that Alejandro had never noticed. The whispered admiration was not just for her beauty or elegance, it was for her presence, her aura of authority, the way she seemed untouchable yet approachable, composed yet magnetic. Alejandro's smile faltered slightly. He tried to maintain the image of control, raising his glass in a forced gesture of cheerfulness, attempting to regain the narrative. "Ah, Isabella," he said, his voice tight. "You really are still here? Watching, observing, I see." The words were meant to assert dominance, but the tremor beneath them betrayed his unease. The guests noticed. Subtle shifts in posture and glances hinted that Alejandro's confidence was beginning to crack. Isabella's smile remained calm, almost imperceptible, as if she were playing a long game only she fully understood. "Of course I am here, Alejandro," she said evenly. Her voice carrying just enough to be heard without commanding. "I wouldn't miss an evening like this, not when so much is being revealed." There was a quiet authority in her tone, a statement of control that needed no embellishment. The room felt smaller somehow, the grandeur of chandeliers and marble, overshadowed by the subtle drama unfolding. Alejandro, sensing the shift, leaned slightly closer to a group of investors, hoping to regain some attention. He laughed lightly, making casual remarks about his achievements, his empire, the life he had built since their separation. Yet, with every word, the contrast between his desperation and Isabella's composed presence grew more obvious. Isabella, meanwhile, moved gracefully, interacting briefly with influential guests, each engagement deliberate and understated. A few whispered in her ear, nodding with approval, their respect and admiration growing. Alejandro watched, a sense of dread creeping into his chest, as he realized that these same guests, who had once deferred to him unquestioningly, were now acknowledging her quietly, subtly, but unmistakably. His dominance, long assumed and rarely challenged, was slipping away. He tried a sharp remark, attempting to belittle her further. "You always think you understand these things, Isabella, but life isn't about appearances or whispers. It's about results, power, and control, things you apparently never cared to grasp." He glanced around, seeking approval, but instead met polite, tense smiles and raised eyebrows. The audience was sensing the imbalance. Alejandro's words, meant to humiliate, only highlighted his insecurity. Isabella's eyes met his, unwavering, steady, and entirely unshaken. "Results," she replied softly, "are important, yes, but so is timing, perception, and knowing how to command respect without arrogance. Those who underestimate patience often find themselves outmaneuvered, Alejandro." Her tone was calm, measured, and devastatingly effective. Every word reminded the room of her intelligence, strategy, and composure. A hush fell over the guests as they observed the subtle battle of wills. Alejandro's forced laughter grew more brittle, his gestures slightly exaggerated as he attempted to redirect attention. Isabella, however, remained the eye of the storm, unshaken and entirely in control. Her aura of calm drew the gaze of everyone in the room. Every whispered conversation paused briefly as her presence quietly dominated the social space. He tried to speak again, gesturing broadly, attempting to assert authority. "You've changed, perhaps, but nothing really alters the truth, does it? I am who I am, I succeeded, and you—" His voice faltered for just an instant, betraying his realization that his carefully constructed image of control was being dismantled before his eyes. Isabella allowed herself a faint, controlled smile, acknowledging the subtle shift. She had anticipated this moment, the subtle panic beneath Alejandro's arrogance, the quiet admiration for her among influential guests, the realization that power was not merely wealth or charm, it was composure, intelligence, and timing. Every calculated gesture reinforced her dominance in a battle Alejandro had assumed he would easily win. A few guests leaned in, murmuring quietly to one another. "She carries herself like royalty," whispered one. I didn't realize." Another nodded, eyes flicking toward Alejandro, recognizing the reversal of roles. The social landscape had shifted, and Alejandro, for all his confidence and bluster, was now on the defensive. Isabella moved closer to the center of the room, deliberately positioning herself where Alejandro could not ignore her presence. The subtle authority in her steps, the grace in her gestures, and the quiet confidence radiating from her left the room buzzing with anticipation. Alejandro tried to regain control, but every action now felt reactive, defensive, and ultimately futile. She allowed her gaze to sweep across the gathering once more, letting it rest on influential allies, important investors, and social peers. Her smile remained calm, authoritative, almost imperceptibly triumphant. Alejandro's chest tightened as he realized that every eye was now on her, every whisper acknowledging her quiet power. His arrogance, once unassailable, was crumbling. The guests sensed the drama, the subtle but undeniable reversal of fortune. Alejandro, who had once commanded unquestioned attention, now felt the weight of scrutiny and quiet judgment. Isabella had not raised her voice, she had not shouted, yet her presence alone had shifted the balance of authority, leaving him exposed. The first hints of his fear became visible in the slight twitch of a hand, a faltering smile, a subtle shift in posture. Isabella, ever patient, allowed these tiny cracks to show, her awareness of every detail reinforcing the audience's perception of her control. She had not needed to speak loudly, yet the room understood. The ex-wife, once dismissed, was now the center of power. Even Alejandro's closest allies were beginning to sense the change. The quiet confidence she radiated contrasted sharply with his forced dominance. Conversation slowed, attention drifted subtly toward her. And for the first time he realized that the social landscape he had relied upon was no longer under his command. Isabella paused briefly near the center, a calm pivot that drew the room's gaze completely. Alejandro froze mid-gesture, and the whispers grew slightly louder, yet no one dared interrupt her quiet authority. The air felt electric, charged with anticipation, respect, and the undeniable reversal of power. She had claimed the stage without a word of aggression. The tension in the grand hall was palpable, a quiet electricity that rippled under the crystal chandeliers. Alejandro stood near the center, still attempting to command attention, but every gesture now felt forced, every smile slightly brittle. He glanced repeatedly at Isabella, who remained at the edge of the crowd, calm, poised, and undeniably magnetic. Her presence was subtle yet impossible to ignore, a stark contrast to his increasingly obvious unease. She had not moved toward confrontation yet. That was never her plan. Isabella knew that power was best demonstrated through patience, composure, and timing. Her strategy was to let Alejandro expose his own insecurity while she maintained an unshakable aura of control. Guests, initially drawn by curiosity, were beginning to sense the shift. Whispers began circulating quietly, subtle nods acknowledging the calm confidence she radiated. Alejandro attempted to reassert himself, laughing too loudly at a joke and clinking his glass. "You see," he said, gesturing broadly, "life moves forward, success is earned, and we must all keep pace. Some of us," he added pointedly, "understand this better than others." His eyes flicked toward Isabella, expecting a visible reaction, some sign of submission. Instead, her gaze was steady, even mildly amused. The effect was immediate. A few guests exchanged glances, sensing the undercurrent of tension and reading it correctly. Alejandro was no longer in full control. Isabella, who had once been dismissed and underestimated, now carried an invisible authority that shifted the energy of the room. Alejandro's forced bravado became increasingly transparent, highlighting the stark contrast between her composed elegance and his fraying confidence. Isabella took a deliberate step forward, moving slightly into the center of the room but without drawing overt attention to herself. Her heels clicked softly against the marble, a rhythm that drew the gaze of nearby guests. There was no aggression in her movements, no need to challenge him openly. Her presence alone communicated power. Alejandro noticed it immediately and felt a tightening in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation. He attempted another remark, raising his voice slightly. Isabella, I hope you understand. This is a world of influence, wealth, and connections. It isn't a place for hesitation or weakness. The words were meant to sting, but they came out sounding defensive. Guests began to shift subtly in their seats and standing positions, sensing the imbalance. Sam, noting how the woman he belittled exuded confidence far beyond his own performance, Isabella responded with a faint, controlled smile. Influence and connections, she said softly, are valuable, yes, but they mean nothing without integrity, patience, and the ability to command respect without arrogance. That is something I have learned very well since our paths diverged. Her words were calm, almost conversational, yet every guest could feel the weight behind them. Alejandro's grin faltered. He had underestimated not only her composure but also the intelligence and subtle strategy she brought to the room. She moved among the guests, engaging briefly with influential figures, shaking hands and exchanging soft words that revealed both her charm and her competence. Alejandro watched, dismayed. As these same guests who had deferred to his authority began to acknowledge hers. A few nodded slightly, whispered softly, and adjusted their posture in ways that highlighted a new hierarchy emerging before his eyes. Alejandro's attempts to reassert dominance grew increasingly transparent. His jokes landed unevenly, his laughter sounded forced, and his gestures became exaggerated in their effort to draw attention back to him. Yet the effect was opposite. Each movement served to highlight the growing influence of Isabella's presence. Guests began to follow her subtly with their gaze, noticing the poise, grace, and confidence she exhibited with effortless ease. Isabella allowed herself to observe Alejandro carefully, noting every micro-expression, the twitch of a jaw, the tightening of his hands, the subtle shifts in stance. She knew that these tiny cracks were evidence of the changing dynamic, signs that her strategy was working. He was no longer the uncontested center of attention. His authority was being quietly undermined by the very presence he had sought to diminish. A hush settled as she moved closer to the center of the room. Alejandro froze mid-gesture, realizing that he could no longer ignore her without appearing petty. Every guest's attention subtly turned toward Isabella, drawn by an invisible gravitational pull created by her calm authority. She did not need to speak loudly. Her posture, her measured movements, and her subtle engagement with the room were enough to command respect. The social dynamics shifted further as whispers circulated among guests. "She's remarkable," one said softly. "I didn't expect her to carry herself like that." Another nodded, eyes flicking toward Alejandro with a hint of newfound awareness. The man who had dominated the room for years was being quietly dethroned by someone he had dismissed. Alejandro's chest tightened further, a cold realization settling over him. He had miscalculated, and the room had noticed. Isabella paused briefly, allowing the attention to fully center on her. Her gaze swept over the crowd, soft but penetrating, acknowledging influential figures, friends, and allies alike. Alejandro's attempts to regain control faltered. He could feel the room slipping from his grasp. Her calm and measured authority contrasted sharply with his increasingly desperate attempts to dominate, making his arrogance appear fragile and outdated. The whispers grew subtly louder. Guests began to comment quietly among themselves, noting her elegance, intelligence, and the quiet dominance of her presence. Alejandro, desperate to re-establish control, gestured toward his closest allies, but even they seemed uncertain, shifting nervously under the weight of Isabella's quiet but undeniable command. She smiled faintly, not in mockery, but in quiet satisfaction. She had predicted this shift and allowed it to unfold with patience, knowing that a controlled approach would dismantle his arrogance more thoroughly than confrontation ever could. Alejandro's attempts to regain his footing only highlighted the growing imbalance. The room, sensing the change, began to acknowledge her as the true focal point of authority, even if unspoken. Isabella's strategic positioning brought her closer to the center, her presence commanding the space without overt action. The guests' attention followed naturally, their whispers tinged with admiration, curiosity, and respect. Alejandro's breath grew slightly shorter, the panic in his eyes barely hidden as he realized the scope of his misjudgment. The power dynamic he had long assumed was unshakable had shifted quietly and decisively in Isabella's favor. Every subtle movement she made reinforced her dominance. Alejandro's forced gestures and strained voice became more obvious, highlighting his vulnerability. The room, once fully under his influence, had turned its attention, consciously or unconsciously, toward the woman he had attempted to belittle. Isabella had achieved a rare and devastating control, command of the room without confrontation, victory without aggression. The tension reached a new pitch as she paused near the center, allowing the energy to settle fully around her. Alejandro froze, the realization of his waning authority hitting him with stark clarity. Guests continued their subtle acknowledgments, some leaning in to whisper, others simply nodding, all reinforcing the undeniable reversal of the social hierarchy. Isabella's calm had dismantled his arrogance, and the stage was set for the final, public affirmation of her triumph. The room fell into an anticipatory hush as Isabella took the final step into the center, her presence now impossible to ignore. Every whisper halted mid-sentence, every gesture froze, and the faint clink of champagne glasses became the only background to a quiet storm. Alejandro, standing near the grand staircase, felt a cold tightening in his chest. The arrogance he had relied on for years faltered in the face of her composed authority. He had mocked her publicly, yet here she was, calm, commanding, and entirely unshaken. Isabella's gaze swept across the crowd with deliberate precision, making subtle eye contact with every influential figure present. Each nod, each tilt of the head, each quiet acknowledgement reinforced the fact that she was now the focal point of the room. Alejandro's smile, once confident and sharp, faltered. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came immediately, as if the atmosphere itself refused to let him assert dominance. Her attire was impeccable, a tailored, deep emerald dress that hugged her form elegantly without ostentation, her hair styled to perfection, cascading softly over her shoulders. Every detail was calculated, every element a quiet assertion of control. Alejandro's eyes followed her, a mix of disbelief and creeping fear slowly replacing the irritation he had worn earlier like armor. The guests noticed the change too. Subtle glances, quick nods, and hushed tones confirmed that Isabella's influence had shifted the room's energy entirely. "Isabella?" Alejandro finally managed, his voice tight, a forced laugh following it. "I see you've decided to make yourself the center of attention." His words, meant to belittle, came off hollow. The room, once his domain, now responded differently. Some guests leaned slightly forward, their expressions subtly indicating intrigue rather than deference to his authority. Alejandro's control was slipping, and he could feel it. Isabella did not respond immediately. She allowed the silence to linger, letting it build tension, making Alejandro's faltering confidence visible to everyone. Then, in a voice calm and clear, she spoke. "I'm here because the truth deserves to be acknowledged, not by arrogance, not by wealth, but by clarity, presence, and integrity." Her words were measured, yet every ear in the room caught the weight behind them. Alejandro's jaw tightened, his hands clenching subtly at his sides. A murmur ran through the crowd. Guests were leaning in, drawn by the combination of composure, elegance, and unmistakable authority Isabella radiated. Alejandro tried to interject, raising a hand, attempting to speak over her, but his voice sounded forced, too loud, too defensive. She allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile to grace her lips, signaling her awareness of his panic without making a spectacle of it. So, Isabella's strategy was flawless. She moved slowly, deliberately, taking a position that naturally drew attention without overtly challenging anyone. Every step she took was a lesson in restraint and poise, highlighting the contrast between her calm composure and Alejandro's fraying arrogance. Guests now whispered quietly to one another, noting the subtle shift in power and recognizing that the ex-wife they had dismissed had become the most commanding presence in the room. Alejandro attempted another gesture of dominance, pointing toward his closest allies, trying to regain attention. "She may think she controls the room," he said, forcing a laugh, "but let's not forget reality. Influence is earned, not imagined." Yet his words were weak. His allies exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the shift in dynamics. Even their loyalty felt strained under Isabella's quiet authority. Her gaze swept the room again, deliberately lingering on Alejandro for a fraction longer than necessary. "Reality," she replied softly, "is what we make of our presence, our actions, and the respect we cultivate. Some of us learn this faster than others." Her words were elegant, precise, and delivered with absolute calm. Alejandro's forced smile faltered completely. He realized, too late, that he had misjudged the depth of her transformation. The guests' reactions were subtle but telling. Slight bows, discreet nods, and soft acknowledgments of her presence spread like a quiet wave across the room. Some whispered among themselves, their tones a mixture of surprise and admiration. Alejandro, meanwhile, froze mid-gesture, acutely aware of the reversal. For the first time in years, he was not the center of control. He was being observed, measured, and, in subtle ways, evaluated by the crowd he once commanded effortlessly. Isabella allowed herself to step closer, the soft click of her heels marking her deliberate movement. Every eye followed her, some with curiosity, some with admiration, and some with a quiet recognition that the social hierarchy had shifted. Alejandro's chest tightened with the growing realization that he had lost the room without even a confrontation. Her calm presence had dismantled the very foundation of his assumed dominance. A few guests whispered audibly, noting the elegance and authority she carried. "She commands this room without raising her voice," one said softly. "It's extraordinary." Another nodded, eyes flicking toward Alejandro with a subtle smirk. Acknowledging the reversal, the shift was complete. The ex-wife who had once seemed powerless was now the unspoken authority, and Alejandro's attempts at control appeared desperate and hollow. Alejandro's voice broke slightly as he tried once more to assert himself. "You think this changes anything?" he demanded, scanning the room for support. The response was silence, punctuated only by polite but distant nods toward Isabella. The message was clear. The power had moved. Guests now instinctively acknowledged her presence before his, a shift Alejandro could neither ignore nor undo. Isabella paused at the center, letting the weight of her presence settle fully. Every subtle movement reinforced her dominance. Her calm posture, measured gestures, and precise eye contact drew all attention to her. Alejandro's attempts to reclaim authority were increasingly futile. Each forced smile, each strained laugh, highlighted the contrast between his desperation and her composed strength. The room felt electric, the tension between them palpable. Alejandro's chest tightened, his mind racing for a way to reclaim dominance, but every gesture, every word only emphasized her control. Isabella's strategy had succeeded. The audience was hers, attention centered on her, and respect quietly flowing in her direction. Finally, she allowed a faint, controlled smile to cross her face, subtle but victorious. Alejandro's arrogance had been dismantled without confrontation, his authority exposed as fragile, and the guests' attention had fully shifted. The stage was set for her ultimate, undeniable triumph, a reversal that would leave Alejandro frozen, powerless, and fully humbled. The tension that had hung thick in the grand hall seemed to crack and shift, finally snapping in Isabella's favor. Alejandro, once so confident, now stood frozen near the staircase, his chest tight, his smile gone, replaced by a flicker of panic that no amount of forced charm could conceal. The murmurs of admiration and subtle approval toward Isabella had grown too loud to ignore, and even his closest allies could no longer hide the shift in attention. Isabella moved deliberately, each step measured, each movement reinforcing the calm authority that had taken over the room. Her gaze swept over the crowd, acknowledging influential figures, investors, and old acquaintances alike. Every subtle nod, every quiet word solidified her position. Alejandro's attempts to dominate the room now appeared desperate, exposed, and almost laughable in their futility. She paused near the center, letting the space around her feel hers. The room seemed to bend to her presence. Alejandro's eyes narrowed, but no words came. The air was heavy with the unspoken acknowledgement that his arrogance had been dismantled. Guests leaned in, murmuring quietly to one another, glancing between Alejandro and Isabella, recognizing the reversal. The ex-wife, once dismissed and underestimated, now commanded undeniable respect. "Isabella," Alejandro finally said, his voice tight, faltering slightly, This is ridiculous. He broke off mid-sentence, realizing that the room would not support his interruption. Every whisper, every gaze reinforced that she was the one holding the authority. His usual tactics, smile, charm, subtle intimidation had no effect. The crowd was no longer his audience. Isabella's aura had claimed them. She allowed a faint, controlled smile to touch her lips, not cruel, but victorious in a quiet, unshakable way. "Alejandro," she said softly, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Some lessons are learned slowly, but the truth always emerges eventually. Authority and respect aren't given. They are earned, and they can be lost in an instant if neglected." Her words, calm yet precise, cut through the remnants of his self-assured facade. Guests whispered among themselves, leaning in slightly, their eyes now following Isabella with subtle reverence. Alejandro's tension grew with every second, his hands clenching at his sides. He had underestimated her patience, her strategy, and her ability to command a room without raising her voice. The realization was crushing. His power had been dismantled without a single loud confrontation. Isabella moved gracefully, her presence commanding the floor, yet never overtly aggressive. Every gesture, every measured step reinforced the quiet dominance she now held. Alejandro attempted to regain control, gesturing toward his closest allies, but even they now looked unsure, their loyalty wavering in the face of Isabella's composed authority. The tables had turned completely. The whispers grew slightly louder as she approached Alejandro, her eyes locking with his. "Do you see now?" she asked softly, almost conversationally, yet the weight of her words was undeniable. "Respect isn't demanded with arrogance, Alejandro. It is earned with integrity, patience, and awareness. You assumed you had control, but you underestimated the power of presence and strategy." Alejandro's jaw tightened, his throat dry. He tried to speak, but the words failed him. The room, which had once deferred entirely to his charm and influence, now silently affirmed her authority. Every subtle gesture from the guests, slight bows, discreet nods, whispered acknowledgments, underscored the finality of the shift. Alejandro's empire of social dominance had been quietly dismantled. She let the moment linger, allowing him to absorb the weight of the reversal. Every second stretched, filled with the subtle but unmistakable dominance of her calm authority. Alejandro's chest tightened further as he realized that he could no longer control perception, no longer command respect, no longer be the focal point. The power was no longer his, it belonged entirely to Isabella. A few guests whispered quietly, their admiration for her growing with each measured movement. "She's extraordinary," one murmured, "to command this room without shouting." Another nodded, eyes flicking toward Alejandro, recognizing the total reversal. The ex-wife, once dismissed, had become the unspoken queen of the evening, commanding attention and respect effortlessly. Isabella allowed herself a faint, triumphant smile, subtle but undeniable. She had played her part perfectly. patient, composed, and strategic. Alejandro's arrogance had faltered, his authority crumbling quietly in front of the room. Every glance, every whisper, every nod now reinforced that she had claimed the stage without confrontation, without overt aggression. Alejandro's attempts to recover were futile. He gestured nervously, tried a forced laugh, attempted to make a comment to shift attention back to himself, but the room's energy no longer responded to him. Guests now instinctively acknowledged Isabella first, following her lead with subtle but unmistakable recognition. The reversal was complete, undeniable, and public. She approached Alejandro one final time, stopping just close enough to ensure he felt the presence of her calm dominance. Her voice, low and controlled, carried a quiet finality. "This is not about humiliation," she said, letting the words sink in. "It's about truth, awareness, and understanding one's place in the world. You have learned, perhaps too late, how quickly influence can shift when arrogance replaces respect." The room seemed to hold its breath as Alejandro's face revealed the last remnants of disbelief and panic. He opened his mouth, trying to regain some sense of control, but the words came out hollow, weak, ineffective. Every whisper, every glance, every subtle movement from the guests reinforced the message. Isabella was the authority, and Alejandro was exposed. Finally, Isabella allowed herself to step back, letting the subtle energy of triumph settle fully. Alejandro's posture stiffened, every muscle tense, as he realized the depth of his defeat. The room's attention, now entirely hers, acknowledged the ex-wife, who had once been dismissed but now commanded respect through patience, strategy, and unwavering composure. A soft murmur of approval spread quietly through the room, guests exchanging nods and subtle acknowledgments of her unspoken victory. Alejandro's forced smile faded entirely, replaced by a bitter awareness that he had lost not only the room, but the perception of dominance he had long relied upon. Isabella, calm, poised, and quietly triumphant, had orchestrated the complete reversal without a single act of aggression. She moved with grace toward the exit, allowing her final glance to sweep across the room. Every subtle gesture, every carefully measured step, reinforced the undeniable truth: respect could not be forced, power could not be demanded, and arrogance was a fragile and temporary shield. Alejandro remained frozen, a man fully aware of his miscalculation, powerless to reclaim the authority he had assumed was unshakable. As Isabella disappeared from the room, the guests quietly acknowledged her triumph, subtle bows and soft nods marking their respect. Alejandro stood, unable to move, consumed by the reality that the ex-wife he had dismissed was now the embodiment of command, control, and undeniable presence. The reversal was complete, public, and irrevocable. The hall seemed to breathe again, a quiet energy settling as guests whispered among themselves, still in awe of the transformation. Alejandro's empire of social dominance had been dismantled without aggression, without confrontation, and without spectacle. Isabella's calm authority had done what his wealth, charm, and arrogance could not. She had conquered perception, commanded respect, and orchestrated an undeniable final victory.